Hello everyone and welcome to today's multi-agency partnership briefing around the Domestic Abuse Act. My name is Martin Webster. I'm the Workforce Development Manager for Darlington Borough Council and I'm joined today by some brilliant guests who I'll let introduce themselves. So we'll start with Chris.
Good afternoon, Martin. Yeah, so my name's Chris Ashford. I represent the Darlington Safeguarding Partnership and I am the multi-agency trainer.
Thanks, Chris. Alison?
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Alison Poulter. I'm the Head of Service at the Children's Front Door and Early Intervention.
Thanks, Alison. Bron?
Hi Martin, I'm Bronwyn Lilly. I'm the Domestic Abuse Commissioning Officer for Darlington Borough Council.
Perfect, thanks Bron. And Jeanette?
Hi, I'm Jeanette McMahon. I represent Housing Services and my job role is to manage the Housing Options team and Lifeline Services.
That's great, thanks Jeanette. So the format for today is we're going to be playing a PowerPoint presentation and I'll be asking our delegates here some of the questions around domestic abuse and the Domestic Abuse Act and they'll be answering for us. And I'll just start with the PowerPoint presentation now. And we'll hand over to Chris for the first question. Okay, thanks for that. So Chris, can you tell us what the Domestic Abuse Act actually is and outline who can be a victim of domestic abuse?
Yes, so the Act is set to provide further protection to victims of domestic abuse. And for the first time, there is a statutory definition. So if we could have the next slide, please. So the statutory definition, what does it say? So it applies where both the victim and the perpetrator are 16 or over and are personally connected. And we'll look at the term personally connected shortly. And the behaviour is abuse. So it acknowledges the broad scope of abuse, including controlling and coercive behaviour, financial and emotional abuse, honour-based violence, female genital mutilation, and forced marriage. It can be a single incident or a course of conduct, and it is gender neutral. So the introduction of the term personally connected, what does it mean? So what it tells us is they are or have been married or civil partners. They have agreed to be married or civil partners, even if that agreement has been terminated. They are or have been in a personal relationship to the same child, or they are relatives. Abuse. So abusive behaviour can include physical or sexual abuse, violent or threatening behaviour, controlling or coercive behaviour, psychological, emotional abuse or other abuse, and again the introduction of a new term with the Act, economic abuse. So economic abuse is described as any behaviour that can have an adverse effect on the victim's ability to acquire, use or maintain property, money, goods or services. Thank you, Martin. The Act makes it clear that children are victims. Where the child sees or hears or experiences the effects of the abuse and is related to the victim or the perpetrator, and a child is anyone up to the age of 18, and related through parental responsibility or the person is related. So again, as I say, it makes it clear that these children are themselves victims of domestic abuse. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to hand over to Bronwyn now. So, Bronwyn, could you tell us about the roles and responsibilities when it comes to the Domestic Abuse Act?
Yep, sure. Domestic abuse is everyone's responsibility. However, there is a structure created under the Act to effect change. Part of this structure is the creation of the statutory office of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. The Commissioner's role is to provide public leadership on domestic abuse issues and encourage good practice in preventing domestic abuse. The Commissioner will monitor the responses of the justice system, local authorities and other statutory bodies to ensure that we're doing the work that we should be doing under the Act. This will involve overseeing and monitoring the provision of domestic abuse services in England and Wales, mapping and monitoring provision of services, making recommendations to public bodies about their responses, carrying out research, working jointly with public authorities and voluntary organisations, and raising public awareness of domestic abuse. Could I have the next slide, please, Martin? Thank you. The Act places a duty on local authorities to provide accommodation-based support for victims of domestic abuse and their children in refuges and other safe accommodation. Local authorities will need to ensure that all victims of domestic abuse and their children have access to the right support within safe accommodation when they need it. This includes victims and survivors from outside of their own local area. So victims and survivors and their children could move anywhere in the country and be able to access the support that they need. Accommodation includes refuge accommodation, specialist safe accommodation for individuals with protected characteristics and complex needs, dispersed accommodation, sanctuary schemes. Sanctuary scheme is where adaptations are made to a property so that survivors can remain within their own home and not having to move to alternative accommodation. Move on and second stage accommodation and other forms of domestic abuse, emergency accommodation. Services include, under the Act, advocacy support, for example, liaising with other services on victims and survivors' behalf, such as GPs, social workers, benefits agencies, to provide domestic abuse prevention advice. This is support to victims to recognise the signs of abusive relationships, to help them remain safe and to prevent re-victimisation. To provide specialist support for victims with protected characteristics and or complex needs, for example, mental health support, drug and alcohol support, and immigration advice. Also children's support, including play therapy and child advocacy, housing-related advice and support, including how to live safely and independently, and counselling and therapy for both adults and children. The Act requires local authorities to appoint a multi-agency domestic abuse local partnership board. We've set this board up in Darlington in collaboration with Durham County Council. Authorities are required to consult with the board before performing certain functions under the Act. The board feeds into its respective Community Safety Partnership Board, which in Darlington is the Community Safety Partnership, or CSP. The Act also requires councils to conduct a domestic abuse needs assessment. This involves mapping out current domestic abuse provision and where the gaps are. The needs assessment will inform the domestic abuse strategy from which commissioning and decommissioning decisions will be made. Authorities report to the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, who monitors their performance and the outcomes from their domestic abuse strategies. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Bron. And we'll move on to Jeanette now. So, Jeanette, please, can you give us, from a Darlington perspective, how do we support people suffering from domestic abuse, and who may be, sorry, I'll start that again. How do we support people suffering from domestic abuse and may be at risk of homelessness?
So initially, I think housing services do take domestic abuse very seriously and hopefully sensitively. We are backed by a number of pieces of legislation that we do follow. So we do have a statutory duty to anyone approaching us who are suffering from domestic abuse. And that can be seen under the Homeless Reduction Act, which has recently been updated to include the Domestic Abuse Act. And we have a code of guidance that sits under that we follow. So basically, it helps us guide as to what we need to do for that individual. Obviously, every individual presentation can be different, so we just have to adapt to what that is. But you know, stress that we have that statutory duty to each and every one of them. So I've just sort of stated there the housing services follow the cross-government definition of domestic abuse, and that basically just means that we understand the Act and that we consider domestic abuse unacceptable, and that we can challenge each other around that. So challenge different agencies and challenge different people to make sure we get the right response and we respond to that, really. Anyone suffering domestic abuse will be given a priority need, so that they will be given a high banding for social housing. So basically they would go into band 1 when they're applying for on the housing register. There is expectation, I think Bronwyn mentioned it a little bit, whilst we provide safe accommodation, we also have to look at the support needs for those individuals. So we work alongside our commissioning partners to ensure that that right level of support is there and that expertise is there. So although housing will provide their level of support, we know that we can't do it on our own, and we will sort of put that across to those experts that we work work alongside. And where we can, we will support that individual to either stay in their own homes if that is appropriate. And there is under the Act, we can house the perpetrator. So it's making sure that the victim is safe so that we can provide that accommodation there. Move on to the next slide. So as I've said, housing options and housing work alongside a number of other agencies and partners. We can't do it on our own. I suppose we're a cog in the wheel, as it were. So we sit on a number of partnership boards and a number of groups to ensure that we are identifying what the support is that that person needs. We are aware of that person. And we can add our level of help for that person. So if someone is in a council tenancy, they're within their own home, and it's appropriate and safe for them to stay there, we will put in extra support to ensure that that person is safe, or we will explore accommodation within our own stock or other temporary accommodation that may help. So at the end of the day, it's ensuring that the person is safe who's presenting to us. And those are a list of some of the groups that we sit on and learn from, really. Next slide, please. So just a little bit around if someone does approach us fleeing domestic abuse or at risk, they will be given a case support worker. So that is one named worker, so they don't have to keep repeating the story. They will be assessed alongside our other partners. We'll work with them. We'll signpost into other services if need be. So I've just written on there who that may be. So we might work with Family Help, Harbour, the Navigator programme, and we do offer interim accommodation. And again, it's just where that person is homeless, we will make sure that that person has a roof over their head and the support that's appropriate for that person. Next slide. I think just put a few facts and figures on there and recognise that domestic abuse is one of the main reasons why people will present as homeless, but also recognise that they often come with a number of other needs. It might not be domestic abuse, they might be suffering mental health, substance misuse, whatever it may be. So again, we will assess that person, make sure that they have that support. So they might need support around the mental health, substance misuse, and we'll make sure that they are referred into those expert providers that we work alongside and help them recover from that homelessness situation. So that caseworker that I mentioned before will work with them all the way through from being at crisis point into permanent accommodation. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jeanette. We'll move on to Alison now. So, Alison, can you tell us a little bit about what Darlington Children's Services response is to domestic abuse, and what should we do if we're worried about a child or a young person?
Yeah, so Children's Services very much believe that domestic abuse is everyone's responsibility, and you've heard all about the definition and the requirements within this Act. And I think what this Act does is really help us with the way we've always worked. It enhances the work we do. It means there's more help, support, and protection. There's many ways that abusers can assert their power over victims, and it's often quite difficult to unpick what exactly is going on for a family. You heard earlier on when Chris set out all of the forms of abuse that's now recognised as domestic abuse, and that's really helped us as a children's front door to start to understand much more with our partners as well as with our families how best we can protect children and help families through experiences of domestic abuse. So I think it's particularly relevant to social care because of some of the requirements that are now within that Act. And it certainly impacts on our work and practice. So we have to fully understand this Act and apply it every day. in the work we do. One of the other really important elements of this Act is that it regards the children as a victim now. And whilst we always did in children's services and across Darlington, it gives us the opportunity to work with our partners in a very different way. There's certain powers attributed to police work, probation work, housing. Obviously, you've heard from Jeanette about the housing elements that can be put in place. So it's a really important piece of legislation. So next slide, please. So if, as I've said, there's many elements in terms of this Act. I've probably touched on a few of them beforehand, certainly around the provision of protection and support, but also our work with our partners, our multi-agency work, and around disclosure schemes such as Clare's Law, which is really very important in our work on a day-to-day basis to look at how best to protect children and help families move through any experiences they're having with domestic abuse. It just gives everybody the opportunity to understand more what that lived experience is for that family, going further than just physical abuse, because I think previously that was an element of domestic abuse that was a lot of the focus. It was very visible at times, but these are the kind of hidden elements of domestic abuse that we all understand much more now, and because it's within this Act set out so clearly, it's going to hopefully lead to better outcomes for our children. So next slide, please, Martin. So if you're worried about a child's safety, it's the Children's Initial Advice team who would take that call if you're a professional. The way we work at our children's front door is you phone a designated professional's telephone line. You will speak directly to a social worker. There's no written referrals, so no need to fill out form after form. You just ring that number, 01325 406 252, and you will speak to a social worker who will work through your concerns. They'll look at the concern in the here and now. They'll look at it holistically. They'll look at the background, and they'll also look at what needs to happen in terms of next steps. We also have a public phone line, so family members can phone up and speak to a business support operator who will speak directly to a social worker if need be, and seek advice and join that concern up with whoever needs to look further into it. You can see the office hours in the presentation, and also our emergency duty team who are on duty out of hours.
That's great. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to Chris now, who's going to tell us a little bit about the criminal justice system. So, Chris, can you tell us the impact that the domestic abuse has had on the criminal justice system?
Yeah, absolutely. And Alison has touched on a couple of the areas there, so I'll just expand on that. So there are some important updates for the criminal justice system. So firstly, perpetrators can no longer cross-examine victims in a court, which is a really important step. Automatic access to special measures extended across the civil court system for victims. Examples given: video link, use of screen, clearance of a court. So those special measures to enable a victim to provide the best evidence. Extending the Serious Crime Act legislation around controlling coercion offences to cover post-separation abuse. A new offence created around non-fatal strangulation to extend the revenge porn offence. So now to cover not only the disclosure of intimate images with the intention to cause distress, but equally the threat to disclose those images. An end to the rough sex defence in court. Clarifying the use of barring orders in a family court to prevent abusive ex-partners from repeatedly taking victims back to court, again abusing that victim again, which can be used as a continuation of abuse. Legal aid, so the Act will prohibit GPs and other health professionals from charging a victim of domestic abuse for documentation, a letter to support an application for legal aid. So some of the measures. So if we could just move on, Martin. So previously known as domestic violence protection notices and orders to reflect that overall term abuse. Of course, they have now been termed domestic abuse protection notices and orders. So what are they? They are a way of managing perpetrators, and as it says, it is an emergency non-molestation and eviction notice to provide immediate protection to a victim following a domestic abuse incident. So it's served by the police service where there are reasonable grounds, okay, to believe that the victim or associated persons or property are at risk. Yeah. And it's where these are used, these notices initially and then subsequently orders are used where there are no other enforceable restrictions in place, such as court orders or bail conditions, whether it be police bail conditions or court bail conditions. And the notice initially lasts for 48 hours and no victim consent is required to issue that notice on a perpetrator. And of course, why 48 hours? Well, that's then to allow the police service to attend a court and obtain the order. So if the order is a consolidation of existing protection orders in relation to domestic abuse and will allow the courts to implement both prohibitions and positive requirements on perpetrators. Many examples of that, including linking in to Jeanette's part of the presentation around provision of housing for perpetrators, perhaps the requirement for that perpetrator to leave the home of the victim. So again, important orders. So the order is obtained at court. There is no requirement for victim or other witnesses to attend court to obtain that order. So hearsay evidence can be provided by the police officer who obtains that order. And breaching either a notice or an order is in itself a criminal offence and carries a maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment. So an important step. Again, Alison mentioned Clare's Law, officially titled, of course, the Disclosure Scheme. And what the Act does now is place the domestic violence, using that term disclosure scheme, Clare's Law, on a statutory footing. So it is the right to ask and the right to know. And it allows the police, where the question has been asked, that request has been made of the police, and that could be a phone call to 101 for the police service, or attending the police office, speaking to a police officer in the street, by whichever means, it's asking about information in respect of a person within that relationship who may be a threat or a perceived threat to the potential victim. So it allows the police to disclose information about an individual's history of abusive and violent behaviour to protect a victim from potential harm. That is the right to ask. And of course, police can decide that an individual is a risk and will consider disclosing criminal history the right to know. So it's enabling domestic abuse offenders to be subject to a polygraph testing as license conditions following release from custody is an additional requirement. So there we have the disclosure scheme, Clare's Law. Okay.
Thanks, Chris. And just following on from that, from a safeguarding partnership perspective, how does multi-agency training work in Darlington?
Yeah, so the partnership offers an extensive program of training, whether it be safeguarding children or safeguarding adults. And there are a number of modules in there. And in respect of domestic abuse, yes, there are domestic abuse training modules, which are part of the multi-agency program. But equally, we can provide on request bespoke sessions around domestic abuse for individual organizations or settings. Okay. Details of the training program can be found on the Safeguarding Partnership website under the tag training. Okay. And predominantly it is myself who provides that training. So you can also make requests directly to me if you require any bespoke training.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just going to move back over to Bronwyn now. So, Bron, you mentioned at the beginning that helping to stop domestic abuse is everybody's responsibility. How can we try and ensure this, and what support is available here in Darlington?
Sure, thanks, Martin. Yes, domestic abuse is the responsibility of all professionals and should be embedded across all agencies, but it's much bigger than that too. Domestic abuse is everybody's responsibility. Domestic abuse is appallingly prevalent and has been referred to as the shadow pandemic. However, domestic abuse is no more common now than it's ever been. It just took a lockdown to underline the shameful reality. Lockdown meant less opportunities for victims to escape and fewer services to go to for support. As mentioned previously, domestic abuse comes in many different forms, and we need to bring all of them out from behind closed doors and into the light. All of us. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will suffer domestic abuse within their life. This could be your sister, brother, work colleague, friend, neighbour, teacher. It could be anyone. Domestic abuse needs to be tackled collectively so that it's treated with the open contempt that it deserves. There are a number of domestic abuse services currently available in Darlington as listed on this slide. I'd like to highlight though at this point that Darlington will be implementing a sanctuary scheme, and details of how to access this will be circulated as soon as it's available. It's important to enable survivors to remain in their own home to minimise disruption to themselves and their children, so long as it's safe to do so.
Okay, thanks very much to everyone for the presentation. You can see on the screen now some further information, links to different websites that would be really useful for colleagues to click on and find out more information. And to find this presentation, you can access it via the Darlington Safeguarding Partnership website, or you can access it by the DBC Workforce Development intranet pages. I'd just like to thank everybody for being involved today and hope you find this useful. Thank you.